48 hours ago, something happened that still doesn't make sense in ordinary terms. Not a dream, not a coincidence. A real event stamped in time that quietly crossed the line between the unseen and the everyday. It began with a transfer. A large one. From a sender with no history, no name you recognized, no explanation attached. At first glance, it looked like a system anomaly, something you'd expect to disappear if you refreshed the screen. But it didn't. It stayed, verified, confirmed, real. And then came the part that makes this moment different from every other story you've heard. The system didn't process it right away. It paused, as if even the technology needed a moment to acknowledge what had just arrived. And in that pause, something shifted inside you. Your breathing changed, your focus narrowed. Not fear, something stranger than that, a sense of recognition, like the moment your name is called in a crowded room before you even realize you were listening. That was the first sign this wasn't about money. Because money doesn't change the air in a room. Money doesn't slow time. Money doesn't make your body respond before your mind can explain why. Over the last 48 hours, this moment has been unfolding quietly, not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently, like a signal that doesn't fade once you notice it. The sender remains unseen, but not careless. This wasn't a mistake corrected later. This was intentional, chosen, timed. Someone somewhere released something at the exact moment when strength and exhaustion overlapped in your life. Not when everything was falling apart. Not when everything was perfect. But right in between. That's the part that changes everything. Because divine events don't always arrive as lightning. Sometimes they arrive as confirmation, as recognition, as a mirror held up to a version of you that has been quietly enduring, bending, adapting, without breaking. And here's the truth most people miss. The transfer wasn't the message. It was the interruption, the signal meant to slow you down just enough to notice that something has already shifted. This story didn't end when the notification appeared, it began. And if you're still listening right now, it's because part of you already feels it. The sense that something is moving, aligning, opening in ways you can't fully name yet. Stay with me, this unfolding has meaning. If this moment resonates, tap the like button so this story reaches others who might need it. Share it with someone who understands quiet turning points. And tell me in the comments, what did you feel when you first heard this story? Let's begin. The moment the transfer arrived, it didn't behave the way money usually does. There was no instant confirmation, no immediate sense of completion, no clean digital snap that said done. Instead, there was a pause. Not the kind of pause caused by poor internet or a system glitch, but the kind that feels deliberate, almost thoughtful. The system seemed to hesitate, as if it needed a moment to understand what it was being asked to carry. Seconds stretched into minutes, minutes into something heavier than time, and it became impossible to ignore the feeling that this delay wasn't random. It felt like a review, a quiet confirmation, as though the system itself was acknowledging that what had just entered it was more than numbers moving from one place to another. That hesitation carried weight. It created space, and in that space meaning began to form. 48 hours ago, when the transfer first appeared, it didn't rush to complete its journey. It lingered, it waited, it invited attention, and in doing so it suggested something profound, that this moment was not meant to be consumed quickly and forgot. The delay itself felt like part of the design, as though the universe had gently placed a hand on the shoulder of time and said, "Slow down, this matters." It was an early signal that this event carried something beyond financial value, something that couldn't be measured by balance sheets or transaction histories. Before the mind could build a story around it, the body responded. Breath changed subtly, becoming deeper, steadier. Focus narrowed, not with tension but with clarity. There was a sudden stillness inside, the kind that arrives when something deeply familiar shows up without warning. It wasn't fear, not even surprise in the usual sense. It was recognition, a quiet knowing that didn't need words. The sensation felt like something sacred brushing up against ordinary life, crossing a boundary that usually stays intact. It was as if an invisible line had been stepped over and nothing on the surface looked different, yet everything underneath had shifted. That reaction lingered. Long after the screen went dark and the notification faded, the feeling remained. The mind tried to catch up, tried to label it, explain it, rationalize it, but the body already understood. There are moments when explanation comes later, if at all, and this was one of them. It felt like standing in a room after someone important has just left, still aware of their presence in the air. The space felt altered, charged, as though something had been deposited there that would continue to unfold over time. Eventually, attention turned to the sender, or rather to the absence of familiarity attached to them. The name didn't trigger recognition. There was no obvious connection, no immediate thread tying this person to the past, and yet the act itself felt intentional in a way that accidents never do. This wasn't a mistake corrected later, not a random gesture explained away by coincidence. It carried the unmistakable signature of choice. Someone somewhere had decided to do this, and that decision had been made with awareness. The strangeness of it wasn't unsettling, it was grounding. There was a sense that this act had been planned long before it appeared on a screen. It felt less like a spontaneous impulse and more like the final step in a process that had been quietly unfolding. The idea settled in that this was a human action guided by something larger, a divine hand working through an unseen agent. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but in the subtle manner that real transformation often arrives, disguised as something simple and ordinary. What made that realization even more powerful was the understanding that observation had preceded the action. This transfer didn't come out of nowhere. Long before the funds moved, someone had been watching from a distance. Not intrusively, not with judgment, but with attention. They had seen endurance play out day after day, struggle carried quietly, persistence maintained even when there was no visible reward. They had witnessed effort continue in the absence of applause, consistency without confirmation that it would ever pay off. There is something deeply human about being seen in that way, especially when you don't know you're being watched. It validates the unseen hours, the moments when giving up would have been easier, the times when progress felt invisible. The sender, though unknown, had recognized something that mattered. They saw faithfulness not as a loud declaration, but as a steady choice repeated over time. And that recognition reached its moment precisely when it was needed most. As hours turned into days after the transfer, the focus began to shift. At first, the mind naturally gravitated toward the amount, toward what it could do, what it could fix, what it could relieve. But slowly, almost gently, that question lost its urgency. Instead of asking how much, a deeper question surfaced, quieter but far more powerful. Why now? Why this moment and not earlier or later? Why after everything that had already been endured? In that question, the idea of divine timing came into sharp focus. Numbers suddenly felt small compared to the orchestration behind them. The transfer began to look less like a solution and more like a marker, a signpost placed deliberately along a longer journey. It wasn't there to end the story, but to underline a specific chapter. To say, this moment matters, pay attention here. That realization reframed everything. The money itself was never the message, it was the signal. A divine interruption designed to stop momentum just long enough to awaken awareness. Life has a way of moving forward relentlessly, even when important signs are trying to get our attention. Days blur together, routines take over, and subtle guidance can easily be missed. There had been signs before this, gentle nudges that whispered rather than shouted, and they had gone unnoticed. Not out of neglect, but out of exhaustion, distraction, and the sheer noise of surviving. This time, the signal was impossible to ignore. It cut through the background hum of daily life and demanded presence. It asked for stillness, for reflection, for acknowledgement. It wasn't about what could be purchased or paid off. It was about recognition, about being reminded that effort had been seen, that endurance had not gone unnoticed, that faithfulness carried weight even when it felt invisible. The interruption created a moment to breathe, to look around, to reassess what had been quietly shaping itself beneath the surface. It suggested that the journey wasn't random, that the delays and struggles weren't wasted time but preparation. It hinted that something had been aligning long before this transfer arrived, arranging circumstances, watching choices, waiting for the exact moment when a signal would land with maximum impact. And in that awareness, something deeper began to unfold, not loudly, not all at once, but steadily, like understanding rising from a place beyond logic. The sense that this was not an ending, not a reward handed out to close a chapter, but a doorway opening mid-story. A reminder that meaning often arrives disguised as interruption, and that sometimes the most powerful messages don't come with explanations, only with presence, timing, and the unmistakable feeling that something greater is at work, continuing to move, to observe, and to guide what comes next. There's something important about the timing of it all, something that becomes clearer the longer you sit with the moment instead of rushing past it. This didn't arrive during a season of victory, when confidence was high and momentum was already carrying everything forward. It also didn't arrive during collapse, when everything felt broken and beyond repair. It came at a very specific point in between, a narrow space where strength and weariness existed at the same time. That place where you are still standing, still moving, still showing up, but doing so on tired legs and quiet resolve. That overlap is rare, and it reveals more truth about a person than either triumph or defeat ever could. That was the moment chosen, not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. Underneath the exhaustion there was readiness that hadn't been acknowledged yet. Not readiness that shouted confidence, but the quieter kind that comes from surviving long enough to be shaped by experience. There is a divine intelligence that understands this difference, that recognizes when someone has been refined enough to receive recognition without being undone by it. The timing reflected a deep understanding of what could be carried now, even if it couldn't have been carried before. By this point, resilience had already done its work. Not the loud, cinematic kind of resilience that looks heroic from the outside, but the steady flexibility that develops when pressure doesn't break you, it bends you. Over time, that bending teaches you how to absorb impact without shattering. The sender saw that. They didn't see someone on the edge of collapse, nor someone inflated by success. They saw someone who had learned how to move with pressure instead of against it, how to adapt without surrendering. That is why this moment was safe for revelation. Safe not because there was no pain left, but because the pain had already done its shaping. There was enough internal strength to receive the signal without being overwhelmed by it, enough grounding to let the unfolding continue naturally. If it had come earlier, it might have distracted or destabilized. If it had come later, it might have been dismissed as coincidence. But here, in this precise window, it could land fully, carrying its meaning intact. As the weight of that understanding settled, the transfer began to act like a mirror, not reflecting back money or opportunity, but identity. A version of the self that had been forgot started to come back into view. Not a new version, but an older one that existed before constant effort made strength feel ordinary and invisible. Routine struggle has a way of hiding progress from us. When you are busy enduring, you rarely stop to measure how much you've grown. In that reflection, strength appeared that had gone unnoticed for a long time. It wasn't dramatic strength, it was the kind built quietly, decision by decision, sacrifice by sacrifice. So many of those sacrifices had never been named, never acknowledged, sometimes not even consciously recognized. They had simply been absorbed into daily life as the cost of continuing. The transfer brought those unseen investments into awareness, offering proof that progress had been happening even when it felt like nothing was changing. That realization shifted the emotional center of the experience. It became clear that this was never about being rescued. There was no sense of being pulled out of a pit or saved at the last second. Instead, there was recognition, acknowledgement. The difference matters more than it seems. Rescue implies weakness, dependence, a lack of capacity to continue alone. Recognition affirms strength, effort, and worth. It says you are already doing it. This didn't create your resilience, it noticed it. Being seen has a unique power. It doesn't replace your agency, it activates it. When someone recognizes what you've carried in silence, it validates the journey without rewriting it. That validation initiates transformation not by removing struggle but by restoring meaning to it. It reconnects effort with purpose. In that way, recognition can be far more transformative than rescue ever could be. What made the moment even more profound was the absence of explanation. There was no message attached, no note to decode, no words telling you what to think or feel. The silence wasn't empty, it was deliberate. In that quiet space, meaning was allowed to rise on its own. The lack of commentary made room for something deeper to speak, something not limited by language. That silence carried an assurance that didn't need to be spelled out. The story is not finished. What you're in the middle of still matters. The unfolding didn't end with the transfer, it moved beyond it. The moment was never meant to close anything. It was meant to open awareness to what was already in motion and what was still becoming. If the primary effect had been relief, the moment might have ended there. Relief tends to settle things, to bring closure, to invite rest in a way that can quietly stop movement. But this wasn't about relief. It was about awakening. Awakening keeps the moment open. It invites questions instead of answers. It creates motion rather than comfort. Instead of easing into stillness, something began to move again internally. Stagnation gave way to momentum, not frantic energy, not pressure to act immediately, but a renewed sense of direction. The transfer didn't soothe everything into silence, it stirred awareness into motion. It reminded something dormant that it was still alive, still capable, still unfolding. And that is what lingered long after the numbers became familiar and the initial shock faded. Not comfort, but clarity. Not an ending, but a continuation. The sense that something unseen had spoken without words, not to conclude the journey, but to mark it, affirm it, and quietly say that what has been building beneath the surface is ready to keep moving forward, one intentional moment at a time. What became clear as time passed was that nothing about this moment was asking for a dramatic reaction. There was no demand for celebration, no pressure to prove gratitude publicly, no expectation of instant action. The unfolding didn't measure emotion or behavior, it measured attention. The real question wasn't how strongly the moment was felt, but how deeply it was noticed. Would it be brushed aside once the initial surprise faded, categorized as luck or coincidence, folded neatly into the story of daily survival and then forgotten? Or would it be held gently in awareness, allowed to breathe, allowed to speak over time? That was the quiet test, not a test of worthiness or obedience, but of perception. Some moments arrive loud and unmistakable, forcing meaning upon us whether we want it or not. Others arrive softly, offering significance only to those willing to stay present long enough to recognize it. This was the latter. The meaning wasn't hidden, but it wasn't aggressive either. It required contemplation, not performance. It asked for awareness rather than reaction, for listening rather than doing. Even 48 hours later, the moment refused to collapse into the past. It lingered not as a problem to solve, but as an invitation to remain present. The fact that it still occupied mental and emotional space was part of its design. Rushed interpretation would have flattened it, reduced it to a simple cause and effect story. But meaning like this doesn't reveal itself under pressure. It unfolds slowly, layering insight upon insight, rewarding patience instead of urgency. There is a kind of stillness that allows divine moments to deepen. Not passive stillness, but attentive stillness. The kind where you resist the urge to label and move on and instead sit with the unanswered questions. In that space, understanding grows organically. The moment becomes richer, not because new information arrives, but because perception sharpens. What first looked like a single event begins to reveal depth, context, and connection. As awareness widened, it became impossible to see the transfer as an isolated incident. It felt like one movement within something much larger, a small but precise motion in a design that extended far beyond one person or one moment. Lives intersect in ways that rarely announce themselves. Decisions made quietly years apart begin to align without explanation. Promises formed long ago, sometimes forgot even by those who made them, resurface when the conditions are finally right. There was a sense that unseen timing had shifted into motion. Not hurried, not chaotic, but active, like gears that had been turning slowly beneath the surface suddenly finding alignment. When that happens, events don't always arrive with drama. Often they appear ordinary on the outside, their significance visible only in hindsight. This felt like one of those moments, a subtle indicator that something long prepared was now entering a new phase of movement. In designs like this, not everyone plays a visible role. Some are chosen to act once decisively and then fade back into anonymity. The sender felt like one of those quiet witnesses, someone positioned not to stay, not to guide or explain, but to initiate change through a single intentional act. There is a reason so many meaningful shifts pass through silence. Noise invites distraction. Silence allows impact to travel farther, deeper, and longer. One intentional act can ripple outward in ways the initiator may never fully see. It doesn't need repetition to be powerful. Its strength lies in precision and timing, not volume. The transfer carried that kind of energy. It wasn't meant to be followed by constant intervention or ongoing visibility. It was meant to start something, not control it. That understanding brought a new level of calm. The pressure to figure it all out dissolved. There was no requirement to immediately define what comes next or how everything connects. The role in this moment was simple but not easy: to witness it fully, to stay aware, to let it inform perspective rather than dictate action, to allow it to integrate naturally into the larger story without forcing conclusions. In that space of quiet attention, the moment continued to work, not loudly, not urgently, but steadily. It reshaped how past struggles were viewed, how present effort was valued, how future possibilities were imagined. It suggested that alignment doesn't always arrive with answers, and that sometimes the most significant shifts happen when something small and precise confirms that unseen forces have been paying attention all along. And so the unfolding continued, not as a test to pass or a task to complete, but as an ongoing invitation to remain awake to timing, to meaning, and to the subtle ways in which intentional acts carried out in silence can initiate change that keeps moving long after the moment itself has passed. At some point, a deeper realization settled in, one that quietly dismantled the need to frame the moment around deserving. It was never about earning anything, never about a reward granted after passing some invisible test. There was no exchange happening, no cosmic transaction balancing effort with outcome. Thinking in those terms suddenly felt too small, too mechanical to explain what was unfolding. This wasn't merit being tallied or justice being served. It was alignment revealing itself in real time, a convergence that followed its own logic, independent of human scorekeeping. The relief in that understanding was subtle but profound. When a moment is tied to deserving, it carries pressure. It invites comparison, self-judgment, and the quiet fear that it could all be taken away if one misstep follows. But alignment operates differently. It doesn't ask whether someone qualifies, it responds when conditions are finally in harmony. That harmony had been forming quietly, patiently, without announcement. The transfer was not proof of worth, it was evidence of timing. That is why the moment felt sudden while also feeling strangely familiar. Years of unseen endurance had been converging toward this point, layering effort upon effort without visible payoff. From the outside, it could look like an overnight shift, the kind people often envy or misunderstand. But from the inside, the illusion of sudden transformation dissolved. Nothing about it was abrupt. It was simply the first visible ripple after a long period of movement beneath the surface. Every season of persistence, every time forward motion was chosen despite uncertainty, had been contributing to this convergence. The delay wasn't denial, it was accumulation. When effort finally met timing, the result felt less like surprise and more like recognition catching up with reality. The moment didn't create momentum, it revealed that momentum had already been building. What changed then wasn't the external future all at once. Circumstances didn't instantly reorganize themselves into something new. The larger shift was internal, and it had already begun. Perspective moved first. The way the past was interpreted softened, the way the present was inhabited sharpened. There was a new sense of forward pull, not driven by urgency or fear, but by clarity. Momentum was active now, not frantic, not overwhelming, but undeniably present. Possibility widened in a quiet way, not as fantasy or unrealistic expectation, but as space. Space to imagine without immediately dismissing. Space to continue without feeling stuck in repetition. The moment didn't promise outcomes, it restored openness. That alone changed how everything else felt. In that sense, the transfer marked a turning point without announcing itself as one. It wasn't a conclusion or a payoff. It was a threshold, the kind you only realize you've crossed after you're already on the other side. The trajectory didn't leap upward dramatically, it bent subtly but decisively, enough to alter the direction of what comes next. Looking back, it became clear that the unfolding had begun long before it was noticed. The transfer didn't start the process, it illuminated it. It gave form to something that had been moving quietly in the background, aligning pieces that would eventually surface. What felt like a single event was actually a moment of visibility in a much longer arc. As time continues to pass, the specifics of the transfer will inevitably soften in memory. Numbers blur, details fade. The emotional charge settles into something calmer, more integrated. But the signal itself does not disappear. Recognition once received leaves a permanent imprint. Being seen in that way reshapes how future moments are interpreted. It lingers as a reference point, a reminder that unseen effort can meet unseen timing and still arrive with precision. That is the meaning that remains, not the transaction but the awareness it activated, not the moment itself but what it set into motion. Some divine events are not designed to complete themselves instantly. They unfold across days through reflection, awareness, and gradual alignment. They continue working long after the initial moment has passed. This one did not end when the transfer settled. It began then. 48 hours ago, something shifted into motion quietly and deliberately. And it is still moving, shaping perspective, guiding momentum, and unfolding at its own pace, asking only for continued awareness as it carries forward into what comes next. 48 hours ago, a silent divine interruption crashed into an ordinary moment and changed everything without noise, without explanation, without force. No thunder, no prophecy, just a clean, undeniable signal that something unseen was watching, aligning, and moving with precision. That moment didn't end here, it opened something in all of us. If this story stirred something inside you, don't let it pass quietly. Hit like, share this with someone who needs it, and tell me in the comments what part stayed with you.